Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into something pretty significant in the energy world, the changing relationship, really, between U.S. oil imports and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, it's a fascinating shift. For years, that connection was, well, almost a given in global energy. But the picture looks very different now.
Right. So, we're going to unpack how the U.S. went from relying heavily on imported oil, with Saudi Arabia as a key source, to actually becoming a net exporter of petroleum.
And what that means for this long-standing partnership, it has some pretty big implications.
Definitely. We've got a detailed report looking at all this, and our mission today is to pull out the key takeaways for you. We want to cover, the big changes in U.S. imports, the history behind the U.S.-Saudi oil connection.
How the U.S. shale boom completely changed things, what Saudi Arabia is doing now with its oil strategy, and the geopolitical ripple effects.
Exactly. So let's just jump in. Where are we seeing the biggest changes when it comes to U.S. oil imports? What's the story there?
Well, the change has been, frankly, dramatic. Historically, the U.S. needed a lot of foreign oil. Imports actually peaked back in 2005.
Okay, 2005 peak reliance.
But then things started to shift. Starting around 2019, the U.S. actually became a net exporter of petroleum products.
Products first, like gasoline and diesel.
Right. Then by 2020, that expanded to total petroleum. And just last year, 2023, it included crude oil and petroleum products combined. It's a complete turnaround.
Net exporter overall, that's a huge headline change. What drove that?
Mostly, it's the massive increase we've seen in domestic oil and natural gas production. That's largely down to shale.
Ah, the shale revolution.
Exactly. New technologies like horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing, they unlock huge amounts of resources. Plus, there's been some reduction in demand too, but production is the main story.
Right, shale really rewrote the map. So if we're producing so much more here, who are we getting our imported oil from these days? Has that supplier list changed?
Oh, absolutely. The sources have definitely shifted. It depends on, the type of crude oil refineries are set up for, geopolitics, simple economics.
Makes sense.
Looking at the latest data, for 2024, Canada is far and away our top source for crude oil imports, over 4 million barrels a day.
4 million from Canada alone. Wow. Okay, so Canada's number one. Who else is on the list?
After Canada, the next biggest suppliers in 2024 were Mexico, then Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, Iraq, Guyana, actually.
Guyana's popped up recently, yeah.
Right, then Nigeria, Ecuador.
Yeah.
But what's really telling is the drop-off from some traditional suppliers. Like Mexico, imports from them in 2024 were the lowest since 1981.
Since 81. Okay.
And for Saudi Arabia, imports were the lowest since 1986.
Lowest since the mid-'80s for Saudi oil. That really puts this shift in perspective. What about refined stuff like gasoline or jet fuel? Are we still bringing much of that in?
We do still import refined products, yeah, although those volumes were also down in 2024. For gasoline, the top sources were places like the Netherlands, Canada, India, South Korea, the UK.
Interesting mix. Europe and Asia, too.
Yeah. And for jet fuel, it was South Korea, Canada, China, India, Kuwait. So even though our need for imported crude has changed dramatically, especially from the Middle East, we still rely on imports for certain refined fuels. Maybe because specific countries have the right kind of refineries.
Okay, so the whole import picture is much more complex now. To really grasp why lower Saudi imports matter so much, let's step back. What was the original deal, the foundation of that U.S.-Saudi relationship?
Well, it really solidified back in the mid-20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And it was basically built on this idea of oil for security.
Oil for security. Sounds straightforward.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The U.S. provided military protection, security guarantees for the kingdom, and in return, the U.S. expected reliable access to Saudi Arabia's huge oil reserves. It was a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy in the region for decades.
And Saudi Arabia has always been a giant in the oil world, right?
Absolutely. They have the world's second largest proven crude reserves, massive production capacity. That gives them enormous influence on global oil markets, especially through OPEC and now OPEC plus pellet.
Okay. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. What about the 1973 oil crisis? That must have shaken things up.
Oh, hugely. The oil embargo. That was a major shock.
The embargo targeting the U.S. specifically.
Yes, because of U.S. support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Several Arab nations, led by Saudi Arabia, cut off oil exports to the U.S. and other countries. It caused massive economic disruption here, gas lines, price spikes. It really drove home how dependent the U.S. was on foreign oil back then.
So it strained the relationship?
Initially, yes, definitely strained things. But interestingly, it also kind of reinforced the strategic importance for both sides. After the dust settled, they realigned the partnership because, well, they still had mutual interests in stable oil markets and regional security.
So even that crisis didn't break the fundamental arrangement. Then came shale. How exactly did the U.S. shale boom hit this relationship?
It was a game changer. Starting in the mid-2000s, those advancements in drilling and fracking technology just unleashed a flood of domestic oil and gas.
Right.
The U.S. shot up the ranks to become a top global producer, sometimes the top producer, and all that new domestic supply directly cut into the need for imports.
And that meant less need for Saudi oil specifically.
Exactly. That's why we saw U.S. imports of Saudi crude drop to that 40-year low in 2024 we mentioned. American shale oil was right here, available.
Okay.
And you see symbols of this shift too, like Saudi Aramco,
Yeah.
their state oil company, closing its main oil office in New York. It just signals that the days of the U.S. importing vast quantities of Saudi crude, like before the shale boom, well, they're probably not coming back.
A 40-year low and closing the New York office. Yeah, those are pretty clear signals. So how's Saudi Arabia reacting? What's their oil strategy look like now?
Oh, they're still a powerhouse. Don't forget, they hold over 270 billion barrels of proven reserves, second only to Venezuela, and they can produce a lot. Their actual production dipped a bit in 2024, about 3%, but that was likely tied to the coordinated OPEC plus cuts to, manage the market.
Right, the OPEC plus decisions.
But critically, they maintain what's called a maximum sustainable production capacity of 12 million barrels per day. That's huge spare capacity, which allows them to be the key swing producer.
Swing producer meaning they can dial production up or down relatively easily to influence prices.
Precisely. They have a lot of leverage within OPEC plus and on the global market because of that ability. So even if the U.S. isn't buying as much directly, Saudi decisions still heavily influence the price Americans pay for oil and gasoline.
Got it. So their market power remains, even if their direct exports to the U.S. are down.
Definitely. And historically, they haven't been shy about using oil production strategically, but there's another big factor now, Vision 2030.
Ah, yes, their big economic diversification plan, trying to move beyond oil dependence.
Exactly. It's a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
And if they succeed, or even partially succeed, in diversifying their economy,
What does that mean for oil?
it could give them more flexibility. They might not feel the same pressure to produce at certain levels just for revenue. They could potentially focus more on, say, maximizing the value of their remaining reserves over the long term, maybe prioritizing sales to growing markets in Asia rather than the U.S. or Europe.
Interesting. More strategic options for them. Let's broaden out again. What are the wider geopolitical consequences of this changing energy flow between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia?
Well, one potential consequence is that reduced U.S. dependence on Saudi oil could give Washington more leeway in its Middle East foreign policy. Historically, the need for stable oil supplies was always a major constraint, right?
Sure, the oil for security bargain kind of locked things in.
To some extent. But it's not like the relationship disappears. It's still important for things like regional stability, counterterrorism efforts. Those broader strategic interests haven't vanished.
So the energy piece changes, but the overall strategic picture is still complex. What about other global players? China, Russia.
Yeah, the energy world is definitely becoming more multipolar. You have Russia as a major producer, China as the world's biggest importer with huge energy needs. Saudi Arabia itself is clearly diversifying its relationships. Look at its growing ties with both China and Russia.
Right.
And for the U.S., even though we've pursued energy independence for decades, especially since the 70s oil shocks,
That term keeps coming up.
it does. And while increased domestic production is great for reducing import reliance, oil is still a globally traded commodity. So international supply disruptions, OPEC plus decisions, global demand trends, they all still affect the U.S. market, regardless of how much we produce ourselves.
So is energy independence even the right goal, or maybe even achievable?
That's a big debate. The goal has certainly driven policy for a long time, national security, economic stability concerns, and renewables are playing a growing part in reducing reliance on imported fossil fuels. But different administrations prioritize differently between fossil fuels and the clean energy transition. And many argue whether complete independence is feasible or even desirable, given global markets and the specific needs of our refineries, which are often designed for different types of crude than what we produce domestically.
So maybe energy security or even energy interdependence is a better way to think about it.
I think interdependence is increasingly relevant. In a globalized world, relying on diverse sources, having interconnected markets, it can actually provide more resilience against disruptions than trying to go it completely alone.
Okay. Let's circle back briefly to that 1973 crisis. You mentioned the lessons learned. How do they resonate today with this evolving U.S.-Saudi dynamic?
Well, 1973 was the starkest reminder of vulnerability to foreign oil dependence. It fundamentally shifted U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And like we said, while it strained the Saudi relationship initially, it ultimately led to a renewed, perhaps more pragmatic partnership. And when you look at current events, the war in Ukraine impacting energy markets, ongoing tensions in the Middle East, it just echoes the need for energy diversification, for resilient supply chains. The idea that oil could be wielded as a geopolitical weapon, which 1973 demonstrated so clearly, is still very much alive today, unfortunately.
Yeah, sobering reminder. And speaking of current events, there was news recently about a big refinery closing in Houston, Leon Del Basel. How does that fit in?
Yeah, that's significant. That refinery had a capacity of over 260,000 barrels per day. Taking that offline reduces overall U.S. refining capacity.
So even if we have lots of crude oil, we need refineries to turn it into gasoline, jet fuel.
Exactly. And losing capacity like that could mean tighter supplies of those refined products domestically. It might actually increase our need for imported gasoline or diesel, even while we're exporting crude.
Huh. Why did it close?
It seems mostly economic. Reports mention the plant's age, the high cost of upgrades needed, especially thinking about the longer-term energy transition away from fossil fuels. It could also affect U.S. fuel exports, since we do export refined products too.
It really highlights how many moving parts there are in the energy system. Okay, so looking forward then, what's the likely path for U.S. oil imports and this U.S.-Saudi energy relationship?
Well, U.S. crude production hit records recently in 2024, but some forecasts suggest we might see production plateau or even peak around, say, 2027. If that happens, we could see import needs creep back up in the future.
So the current trend might not last forever.
Possibly not. And energy interdependence, as we discussed, is likely the reality going forward. So the U.S.-Saudi energy connection isn't going away, but it will continue to evolve. It'll be shaped by global market shifts, U.S. policy choices, and definitely by how Saudi Arabia pursues its Vision 2030 goals.
Less direct crude volume, maybe, but still linked.
Right. Direct U.S. crude imports from Saudi Arabia might stay low or fluctuate, but Saudi Arabia's influence on the global price of oil will continue to matter significantly to the U.S., and we might see cooperation shift towards other areas, perhaps LNG, maybe investments in renewables or clean energy tech.
Interesting. New avenues for partnership beyond just crude oil. So let's try to sum this up. The big picture is the U.S. shale revolution dramatically cut direct U.S. reliance on Saudi crude oil, pushing Canada into the top supplier spot.
Correct. A major shift in flows.
But Saudi Arabia is still a giant in the global oil market, a key swing producer influencing prices that affect everyone, including the U.S.
Absolutely. Their market power endures.
And that old oil for security dynamic is changing, evolving towards something else, potentially a more diversified energy relationship,